The United States is now facing the one scenario every empire fears most: a war it cannot win, an economy it cannot stabilize, and a global order it can no longer fully control. And if you think that sounds dramatic, stay with me, because what's unfolding right now around Iran is not just another Middle Eastern conflict. This is the beginning of something far larger. What happens next could determine whether the American-led world order survives at all. Because behind closed doors, military planners, intelligence officials, Gulf monarchies, China, Russia, they all understand the same terrifying reality. If the United States fails against Iran after everything it has already committed, the psychological foundation of American global dominance begins collapsing in real time. And this is why the situation has become so dangerous. The media keeps presenting this as though it's simply another temporary regional crisis. It's not. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries an enormous percentage of global energy flows: oil, natural gas, industrial commodities, shipping routes critical to the global economy. And now the United States is discovering something deeply uncomfortable. Military power does not automatically translate into strategic control anymore. That's the lesson Iran forced Washington to confront. Because despite all the rhetoric, despite all the threats, despite the sanctions, despite the military buildup, despite the carrier strike groups, despite the intelligence operations, Iran did not collapse. Iran absorbed the pressure and adapted. And if you thought that was bad, it gets even worse from here. Because now regional actors are beginning to recalculate their entire relationship with Washington based on that outcome. Look carefully at Saudi Arabia right now. Publicly, they still speak cautiously. Publicly, they still maintain diplomatic alignment with the United States. But privately, something fundamental has changed. The Saudis are no longer convinced America can guarantee security in the region the way it once could. That is a massive geopolitical shift. For decades, Gulf monarchies based their survival strategy around one assumption: the United States would always dominate militarily and would always be capable of crushing any regional challenger decisively. But Iran surviving this confrontation shattered that perception, and perception matters enormously in geopolitics. Empires survive not only through raw force, but through belief in the inevitability of their power. Once allies begin doubting that inevitability, the entire structure starts weakening from within. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Gulf states are beginning to hedge. They're opening channels with China. They're negotiating quietly with Iran. They're exploring regional security arrangements that reduce dependency on Washington. And the reason is simple. They no longer want to be trapped on the losing side of a strategic transition. Now think about how extraordinary this moment actually is. For years, Western policymakers treated Iran as though it were isolated, weak, desperate, and on the verge of collapse. That narrative dominated Western media constantly. But reality told a completely different story. Iran built missile systems, drone capabilities, proxy networks, industrial resilience, energy leverage, maritime disruption capability, and perhaps most importantly, strategic patience. Tehran understood something Washington failed to grasp. Modern wars are not won purely through superior technology anymore. They are won through endurance. And endurance is where the American system is becoming vulnerable. Because the United States today is not the America of 1991. It's not even the America of 2003. The industrial base is weaker. The debt crisis is worse. Political polarization is extreme. Social cohesion is collapsing. Manufacturing dependency on foreign supply chains has become dangerous. And after decades of endless war, public appetite for another prolonged conflict is extraordinarily limited. This creates a strategic contradiction Washington cannot solve easily. American leaders still want to project global dominance, but the domestic foundations necessary to sustain that dominance are eroding rapidly. And if you think the military leadership doesn't understand this, think again. Behind closed doors, many Pentagon planners already know that prolonged regional escalation with Iran could trigger consequences far beyond anything policymakers are publicly admitting. Because here's the terrifying part nobody wants discussing openly. The United States may possess overwhelming strike capability, but it does not possess immunity from economic retaliation anymore. That changes everything. Iran doesn't need to invade anyone. Iran doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy conventionally. Iran only needs to create enough instability across strategic trade corridors to trigger economic shockwaves globally. That's the new battlefield. Energy disruption, shipping disruption, commodity disruption, insurance disruption, supply chain disruption. The modern global economy is incredibly interconnected and fragile. Small disruptions create massive ripple effects, and this is where the Strait of Hormuz becomes critical. Western audiences hear the name constantly, but rarely understand its actual importance. A significant portion of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through that narrow corridor. If instability there intensifies long enough, the consequences become global almost immediately. Energy prices rise, transportation costs rise, manufacturing slows, inflation spikes, food production suffers, financial markets panic, political instability spreads internationally. Now ask yourself a simple question. If the United States launches another major strike campaign against Iran, and Tehran responds aggressively in Hormuz, who actually suffers economically first? The answer is not Iran alone. Europe suffers. Asia suffers. Global South economies suffer. Financial markets suffer. Even the United States suffers. And this is why many Gulf states are becoming increasingly cautious about supporting another round of escalation. They understand the economic consequences could spiral completely out of control. But if you think economics is the only issue, the military side is becoming even more complicated. Because the operational reality has changed dramatically over the past few years. Iran is no longer isolated strategically. Russia and China are both deeply invested in preventing total American dominance over the region. Not necessarily because they love Iran ideologically, but because they understand what Iran represents geopolitically. Iran sits at the center of critical Eurasian connectivity routes. That matters enormously. China's Belt and Road strategy depends heavily on stable westward integration routes. Russia needs southern connectivity corridors. Energy flows matter. Transportation networks matter. Trade routes matter. If the United States destabilizes Iran successfully, Washington gains leverage over a huge portion of Eurasian economic integration itself. So from Moscow and Beijing's perspective, Iran is not merely a regional partner. Iran is a strategic anchor inside the larger struggle over the future world order. And if you thought that was shocking, this next part is even more dangerous. The United States increasingly appears trapped between political rhetoric and military reality. Publicly, politicians continue making maximalist statements about defeating Iran, restoring deterrence, protecting global order, and preserving stability. But military officials privately understand the operational limitations far more clearly. Opening the Strait of Hormuz militarily is not simple. People hear phrases like freedom of navigation operations and assume the United States can simply force its way through without consequences. That's fantasy. The strait is geographically narrow. Iranian missile systems, drones, naval mines, fast attack craft, and asymmetric tactics create enormous risk concentration inside confined maritime spaces. Even if the United States eventually imposed partial control militarily, the economic damage caused during escalation could already be catastrophic. And this is precisely why some American military officials have become increasingly cautious. Because wars are easy to begin politically. Sustaining them strategically is another matter entirely. Look at Ukraine. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Iraq. The pattern repeats constantly. Washington enters conflicts believing overwhelming power guarantees manageable outcomes. But prolonged wars expose deeper vulnerabilities, industrial strain, alliance fatigue, economic cost, domestic division, and credibility erosion. Iran studied all of those wars carefully. Tehran understood it could never match the United States symmetrically. So instead, Iran built an asymmetric strategy specifically designed to exploit American weaknesses. Cost imposition warfare, strategic patience, regional deterrence through distributed capability, economic disruption leverage, long-duration resistance. This is not accidental. Iran spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. And now Washington is discovering that removing regimes is easier than controlling the consequences afterward. Now let's talk about Israel, because this dimension is becoming increasingly explosive politically inside Washington itself. Israel sees Iran not simply as a rival state, but as an existential long-term strategic threat. That mindset drives enormous pressure for continued confrontation. But American interests and Israeli interests are not always identical, despite what politicians publicly claim. The United States must think globally. Israel thinks regionally. And that difference matters enormously when escalation risks become systemic. Because another major war with Iran would not remain contained neatly inside one theater. The Red Sea could destabilize further. Iraqi militias could intensify operations. Gulf infrastructure becomes vulnerable. Maritime trade corridors become uncertain. Energy markets panic. Cyber attacks increase. Proxy conflicts expand. And if escalation continues long enough, great power involvement increases indirectly through intelligence, logistics, and economic coordination. That's why this situation now resembles something far larger than a normal regional conflict. It resembles the early stages of systemic geopolitical transition. And throughout history, periods of systemic transition become extraordinarily dangerous because declining powers often refuse accepting reduced dominance peacefully, while rising powers increasingly resist old structures of control. That's exactly where we are now. The American-led unipolar order created after the Cold War is weakening. But the new multipolar system has not stabilized yet. That creates uncertainty everywhere. Alliances become unstable. Financial systems become contested. Trade networks fragment. Military tensions increase. Strategic trust collapses. And perhaps most dangerous of all, leaders begin making decisions under pressure and fear rather than long-term strategic clarity. Now, if you stay with me, because this next part explains why the economic side may ultimately matter more than the bombs themselves, you'll understand why many countries are quietly preparing for a post-American regional structure in the Middle East already. The dollar system depends heavily on confidence. That's critical. For decades, global energy trade reinforced dollar dominance continuously. Oil transactions, financial settlements, reserve systems, all tied deeply into American economic power. But now alternative systems are emerging slowly. China pushes yuan settlements. Russia bypasses Western financial systems increasingly. Regional trade agreements diversify payment structures. And Iran, despite sanctions, became a testing ground for operating outside full Western economic control. This alarms Washington enormously, because once enough countries realize they can trade, coordinate, and survive without complete dependence on American-controlled systems, the leverage of sanctions weakens dramatically, and sanctions have become one of the primary instruments of modern American power projection. That means the real battle is not only military, it's financial, it's structural. It's about who shapes the rules of the next international system. And right now, the United States appears increasingly willing to use instability itself as a mechanism for preserving dominance. That's the dangerous part, because stable integration across Eurasia weakens American leverage. Stable cooperation between Gulf states and Iran weakens American leverage. Stable energy systems outside dollar control weaken American leverage. So instability becomes useful strategically, at least temporarily. But instability is incredibly difficult controlling once unleashed. That's the lesson history teaches repeatedly. Empires often believe they can manage escalation surgically. They usually cannot. And if you thought the political climate inside America itself wasn't affected already, look around carefully. The public is exhausted. Trust in institutions is collapsing. Economic pressure is growing. Debt levels are exploding. Social fragmentation is worsening. Yet foreign policy elites continue behaving as though endless global confrontation remains sustainable indefinitely. It isn't. And sooner or later, reality imposes limits even on superpowers. The frightening part is that many leaders still seem unwilling accepting those limits intelligently. Instead, they continue escalating rhetorically because admitting strategic decline politically feels impossible. But denial does not stop decline. It accelerates miscalculation. And that may be the most dangerous part of this entire crisis. What makes this crisis even more dangerous is that the people making the biggest decisions in Washington still appear trapped inside a worldview that no longer matches reality. They still believe the United States can intimidate countries into submission through pressure alone. They still believe sanctions automatically create collapse. They still believe military escalation restores deterrence. But the world they built those assumptions on no longer exists. And if you think that's an exaggeration, look carefully at what has already happened over the last several years. Russia survived the largest sanctions campaign in modern history. China continued rising despite economic containment efforts. Iran absorbed decades of economic warfare and still emerged strategically stronger than most analysts predicted. That should have forced a complete reassessment in Washington. Instead, the opposite happened. The pressure intensified. And this is where history becomes extremely important because declining powers throughout history often become more aggressive precisely when they sense control slipping away. That is the pattern we are entering now. The United States is no longer operating from unquestioned supremacy. It is operating from strategic anxiety. And strategic anxiety produces extremely dangerous behavior because policymakers begin viewing every compromise as weakness and every regional challenge as existential. That mentality destroys strategic flexibility. Now let's look honestly at what Iran accomplished psychologically during this confrontation. This is critical. Iran proved that the United States and Israel could strike it directly and still fail to impose decisive political collapse afterward. That changes perceptions globally in ways Western media still does not fully understand. Around the world, countries are watching this carefully. They're studying the outcome. They're analyzing what it means for American deterrence. And many are reaching the same conclusion. The United States remains powerful, but it is no longer all-powerful. That distinction changes international behavior dramatically. Because once countries stop believing American pressure guarantees inevitable defeat, resistance becomes more likely. Hedging becomes more common. Independent diplomacy expands. Alternative alliances emerge. Financial diversification accelerates. This is exactly what we're seeing now across the global South. And if you thought Washington wasn't alarmed by that trend, think again. The real fear inside the American foreign policy establishment is not merely losing one regional confrontation. The real fear is losing the psychological dominance that held the post-Cold War order together. Because after the Soviet Union collapsed, American power depended heavily on perception. Countries aligned with Washington not only because America was strong, but because they believed resistance was ultimately futile. Iran challenged that belief directly. Now here's where things become even more unstable. The economic consequences of prolonged confrontation are beginning to move from theoretical to structural. For months, governments and financial institutions attempted managing the narrative by pretending the disruptions were temporary, controllable, manageable. But markets cannot suppress reality forever. The global economy depends on energy stability. It depends on reliable shipping. It depends on predictable trade routes. And right now, all three are under pressure simultaneously. The Strait of Hormuz remains vulnerable. The Red Sea remains unstable. Insurance costs remain elevated. Shipping routes remain disrupted. Commodity markets remain uncertain. And perhaps most importantly, confidence itself is beginning to erode. That matters enormously because modern financial systems are built heavily on confidence psychology. Once fear spreads across enough sectors simultaneously, economic slowdown accelerates very quickly. And this is where the United States faces a terrifying contradiction. Further escalation against Iran could deepen global instability dramatically. But failing to escalate risks appearing weak strategically after months of threats and military buildup. That's the trap. And once great powers become trapped between credibility concerns and strategic limitations, the probability of miscalculation rises sharply. Now think carefully about Saudi Arabia's position in all of this. The Saudis understand something fundamental. Geography cannot be changed. America is far away. Iran is not. That reality shapes strategic thinking, whether politicians admit it publicly or not. Gulf monarchies may cooperate with Washington, but they also understand they must coexist regionally with Iran permanently. And if American protection begins looking less absolute over time, regional accommodation becomes increasingly attractive. That is why China's role matters so much here. Beijing is offering Gulf states something Washington increasingly struggles providing: economic integration without demanding permanent military confrontation. China wants stable energy flows, stable trade routes, and stable investment conditions. That naturally aligns with regional de-escalation efforts. Meanwhile, the American model increasingly revolves around militarization and pressure. Countries notice the difference. And if you thought this competition was only about economics, it goes far deeper than that. This is ultimately a competition between two visions of world order. One model depends on centralized military dominance backed by financial coercion. The other depends on distributed economic integration backed by infrastructure and trade. That's the larger struggle unfolding underneath the headlines. And Iran became one of the key battlegrounds in that struggle because Iran sits directly at the crossroads of Eurasian connectivity. Now let's talk about Russia, because Moscow understands the stakes perfectly. Russia watched what happened in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine. Moscow concluded long ago that the United States uses instability strategically to prevent independent regional power centers from emerging. That's why Russia increasingly supports multipolar arrangements internationally. Not because Moscow is altruistic, but because a fragmented multipolar world reduces American unilateral leverage. Iran fits directly into that strategy. So does China. And this is why the three countries increasingly coordinate despite their differences. They all understand the same thing. If Washington successfully isolates one of them, the others become more vulnerable next. That creates powerful incentive for cooperation. Now, if you stay with me here, because this next part explains why the future could become even more unstable than most people imagine, you'll understand why many analysts believe the old world order may already be beyond repair. The post-Cold War system depended heavily on American industrial superiority, financial dominance, military supremacy, and alliance cohesion all functioning simultaneously. But now every pillar is under strain at the same time. Industrial superiority shifted heavily toward Asia. Financial dominance faces slow diversification pressure. Military supremacy remains immense but increasingly expensive sustaining. Alliance cohesion is weakening under economic and political stress. That combination is historically dangerous, because systems rarely collapse from one problem alone. They weaken through multiple pressures converging simultaneously. And right now, the United States faces military overstretch, debt expansion, political polarization, industrial dependency, and growing international resistance all at once. That's why the confrontation with Iran matters far beyond the Middle East. It's exposing the structural limits of American power publicly. And if you thought Washington could simply retreat strategically and stabilize the situation peacefully, there's another problem. Domestic political culture inside the United States increasingly punishes restraint. Politicians fear appearing weak more than they fear long-term overextension. Media narratives reward confrontation. Defense industries profit from escalation. Intelligence bureaucracies justify expansion through threat inflation continuously. All of this creates momentum toward perpetual conflict, even when strategic logic argues for restraint. That's one reason this situation has become so difficult controlling. Now look at what's happening with military deployments. Carrier groups remain positioned aggressively. Air assets remain forward deployed. Regional bases remain active. Why? Because Washington still hopes pressure itself may force concessions eventually. But Iran learned something extremely important over the past decades. Survival is victory. That's the key. Iran understands it does not need to defeat the United States conventionally to succeed strategically. It only needs to avoid collapse while imposing sufficient political and economic costs over time. That is classic asymmetric strategy. And historically, asymmetric strategies become extremely effective against powers dependent on maintaining global image and financial confidence simultaneously. The United States can destroy infrastructure. It can launch devastating strikes. It can project enormous force. But can it restore long-term regional stability afterward? Increasingly, the answer appears uncertain. And uncertainty is deadly for empires, because once allies begin doubting your ability to control outcomes, they start making independent calculations. That's exactly what Gulf states are doing now. That's exactly what Turkey is doing. That's exactly what much of the global South is doing. And this may be the most important geopolitical shift of all. Countries are increasingly prioritizing flexibility over loyalty. They no longer want absolute alignment with one power bloc. They want maneuverability inside a multipolar environment. That trend weakens every traditional alliance structure built during the Cold War and post-Cold War eras. Now let's discuss the dollar system, because this issue could eventually become more important than military conflict itself. So instead of adapting strategically, many continue escalating pressure, hoping somehow the old order can still be preserved through force. But force cannot reverse structural shifts indefinitely. History proves that repeatedly. And if you think this process will remain contained geopolitically, think again. Economic instability eventually becomes political instability internally. Inflation pressures populations. Supply disruptions increase social frustration. Debt crises weaken governments. Polarization intensifies. Trust collapses further. That's already happening across much of the West. And the longer global instability continues, the harder stabilization becomes. This is why many countries are now quietly exploring entirely new security architectures independent of Washington. Regional integration, energy cooperation, alternative trade systems, multipolar balancing arrangements. Not necessarily anti-American structures, but post-American structures. That distinction matters, because the future world may not involve one dominant superpower replacing another directly. It may involve fragmented regional blocs balancing each other constantly instead. That would represent a historic transformation, and periods of transformation are always dangerous because old rules stop functioning before new rules fully emerge. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, then you already understand the real issue isn't simply whether the United States attacks Iran again.